Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Beyond Device-Centric Computing, Breaking Barriers to Enable Productivity. During this webinar, you will learn about the issues and constraints associated with delivering end-user computing, the changes in the workplace and evolving working patterns, and the benefits of moving towards user-centric computing. Our esteemed presenters today are Harry Labana, the VP and CTO of AppSense. Hello, Harry.
Hello.
He has spent most of his career on both sides of the fence as a recognized expert in desktop virtualization and an IT consumer. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. I have, yes.
And our second presenter is Martha Bennett, the head of strategy at Freeform Dynamics, an IT industry analyst firm. And Martha has spent the last 25 years in what she calls the intersection between business and IT, with a particular focus on IT business alignment. Is that correct?
That is indeed correct. And good afternoon, or indeed good morning to everybody.
Great. So at this point, why don't we just kick things off? And Martha, take it away.
Okay, then. So let's start by looking at what we call the personal in what is part of PC. This is about my computer. That computer may belong to the company, but people can get quite possessive about it, which is why I've called this slide, whose desktop is it anyway? It may have the company sticker on it, but I may have put my own wallpaper on it. That's the very personal aspect. But then there are also other things that are quite personal to me. For example, the preferences that I'm setting in my applications, whether that's the view of my email window, how the preview is displayed, whatever, how other office productivity applications are set up, which icons and shortcuts appear on the desktop, in the menu bar, etc., etc., etc. All of these things make that piece of kit that the company has issued to me, whether that's a fixed desktop or increasingly in many organizations a notebook computer, they make that mine. And last but probably by no means least, there are the applications that I may want to access, and those increasingly aren't necessarily all ones that the company has actually issued to me as part of the portfolio that they want me to use. And that's really where the tensions come in. So if we look at how the user perceives this, or how the user feels about IT, and I think that should be shown on the next slide, then that tension becomes quite clear. It's a bit about perception, and we seem to have some issue in getting the next slide to move through, but the issue remains the same, is that many of the controls that are being put in place are actually felt by the end user to be unduly restrictive, which is why I put a slightly provocative little cartoon there with IT defending that computer from the user doing anything that they're not meant to do. And in some cases, of course, it's quite understandable as to why that should be so, because, for example, if I want to change the DVD region on my notebook PC, then why am I not able to do that? You know, that's such a straightforward little thing, doesn't do anything nasty, and yet the level of privilege that's required in most operating systems to change the DVD region would then also allow me to make all kinds of other changes that would not be so wonderful for me to make, because they could open up security loopholes, or they could increase support costs and negatively impact my own productivity if I manage to make a complete mess of my desktop and need IT to help me sort it out. But of course, I don't necessarily see it that way. All I can see is that this thing is completely locked down. Whereas from an IT perspective, it looks a little bit different sometimes. It's like, is the user wanting to have a party here? You know, are they just trying whatever they want to do? This is meant to be a work PC, not something for the user to have fun with. Or do you see that differently, Harry?
Yes, well, having spent most of my career actually on the IT side, I'd like to think that I wasn't necessarily always wearing a security chain around my neck. Look, I think I get that users have more choice and they want more freedom. but I also think IT sometimes takes it on the chin a little bit unfairly. I think IT's job is effectively to protect the enterprise. I think all IT is really trying to do is trying to do the best job they can with the technology that's available to them. So I don't always think IT is trying to stop. What IT is trying to do is trying to do it in a sensible way and still provide the governance and protection to the enterprise. And I think, there are trends out there that are kind of going to continue to increase this tension where, IT is being asked to predict what the users will want to do their jobs and asking them to accept. And I think, Martha, you have some great research. Perhaps, you can take us through some of those trends.
Yep. And one point that I'd like to pick up on that you just made, Harry, you're absolutely right, and that, of course, in the final instance, IT's responsibility is to the business and to make sure that the business is protected and that costs are kept under control. I suppose what we're trying to do here is bring that end user and the personal back into the equation and see how we can how we're able to balance those needs a bit better going forward. But let's look at some of the research that you just alluded to, Harry. And the main point that I'm trying to bring out here with this data set that you see in front of you, what I should mention is that this research was carried out as part of a project that we did on productivity. And it was a global survey that was carried out in May of last year. So it's quite fresh data. And the main point to illustrate here is that what we are seeing very clearly demonstrated in these numbers are changing working patterns. It's no great surprise to see that office working from a fixed permanent desk remains the most frequent way of working. But what is really striking is that not only is there a tendency away from having this workplace of a fixed permanent desk, what we're also seeing, because when you look at those numbers, nothing adds up to 100 in that, which means that people are increasingly working in multiple locations. And those multiple locations are not just the desk and in the field for somebody whose work takes them out away from their desk. It increasingly includes the person's home. And I'm sure there are many, many people on this call today that are either possibly even taking this particular webinar from their home office, or they are still at home, if you're depending on what time zone you're in, taking it from a personal computer. And that's really the trend that we're seeing, multi-location involving multiple devices and multiple work scenarios. For example, a company PC in the office, whether that's fixed or a notebook, own PC at home, company-issued notebook PC connected both in the office and at home, and potentially in some completely different locations as well. Hot desking as well, of course, that's a trend that's been increasing for a number of years and will continue to do so. And then, of course, we've got new types of devices to throw into the mix, for example, tablets. And that applies in particular to senior management, but I'll get back to that in a moment. And of course, depending on the industry, field reps will have all kinds of mobile devices as well. And another key point to make in the context of these changing working patterns that has a direct influence on the IT department and what they're having to achieve in trying to balance the needs of the business versus the needs or the wishes of the user, and that is the different kinds of work scenarios that you can run again. So, for example, that you have a situation where somebody uses a company notebook in the office, which of course is perfectly fine, but when they're connected from a hotel room in a remote former Soviet republic ending in Stan, for instance, then they might not be able or should not be able to get the same access to the same data that they can in the office, and so on. But in connection with those changing working patterns, it's also important that we look at and dispel a couple of myths which are outlined in the next slides. And those myths are around what you might call the consumerization of IT, And in fact, I've renamed that in that next slide into Bring Your Own IT. And I have put that with a question mark as well as an exclamation mark, and I hope it'll become clear as I just go through my comments here why I've put those two punctuation marks. It's not an accident. So myth number one is Generation Y is the driving force behind what's often referred to as bring your own device. A lot of people are trying, and I've seen a number of vendors do this. They're trying to scare IT departments into, everybody's wanting to bring their own device and connect it to the corporate network. You won't be able to attract Generation Y if they can't bring their own devices. But that's not really the case. I'm sure there will always be examples for everything. But on the whole, research as well as my own personal observation and other anecdotal evidence don't actually bear this out. It's actually the senior execs that are coming along with their latest must-have device, and typically that's an iPad, and they tell IT that this device will be connected to the network. And if the answer from IT is, there are security risks, this and that, very often they get the answer, that wasn't the answer I was looking for. Come back when the answer is yes. So if you look at that chart on the right-hand side, of course, IT staff are typically the ones that want to try things out, and quite rightly so, because if it's done well, that's when you discover how to do it without having the company exposed to security risks. But then it's very much the senior execs that are driving it. And they're driving it in some cases because it's the latest must-have device. But leaving that, what I might call vanity aspect to one side, there are some very, very good business reasons why executives are seeing the potential of introducing tablet machines to the corporate environment. For example, I know of one bank that said in no uncertain terms that they want interactive reporting available out of their business intelligence systems in all senior management and board meetings in order to support more effective decision-making with real-time data. So there are some very, very positive reasons behind this drive as well. But it's not Gen Y. Myth number two, it's possible to ban bring your own device. There are, of course, companies and situations when that is a desirable or appropriate course of action, and there are always sensitive environments where you have demarcated email, etc., etc. Outside of those highly, highly sensitive environments, it is fair to say that it is certainly not possible to prohibit bring your own device. And we have seen this in our research in the same survey from which the data is that you see in front of you at the moment. We also asked people about their attitudes to bring their own device, including, do you encourage it, do you have a policy for it, do you discourage it, do you ban it completely? And what we found is that the number of companies who ban bring your own device completely is actually smaller than the number of companies who admit that personal devices or non-company owned devices are being connected to the network. So put it slightly flippantly, the holes in the dike. We're not talking about a flood yet. Most companies, again, despite some of the somewhat screaming headlines, most companies aren't at this point overwhelmed by the desire of people wanting to bring their own devices. But the trend is definitely happening. There is a lot of pressure from executives, as I've already outlined, and it is simply not possible to ban it completely. People will find a way around, typically, in whichever way that may be. But before I just go on to myth number three, another point here that's worth clarifying, bring your own device is really about connecting a personally owned device to the company network with the same access and capability that a company-issued piece of kit would have. But then there is a whole spectrum in between that and no access, and that is being able to access a certain proportion of corporate applications from a device that you own, but not necessarily bringing that device to the office, but having that device in your home, like using your home PC. And this is where we get to myth number 3. People are used to a lot of sophisticated tools and services on their home PC, ease with which you can these days file and categorize photographs, doing some data visualization, collaborating with people, sharing content, whatever it may be. And then when you get to the office, you suddenly find that things are a lot more restrictive. And this is why it's important to note that consumerization is not all about devices. That equating consumerization with bring your own device, that's myth number 3. Because really what consumerization is about, not only being able to use your own device for work purposes, but also accessing apps and resources for work purposes that are either essentially consumer services or technologies, or you're just choosing your own favorite application or sort of service to support your work. That could be, for example, to carry out particular tasks. I've already mentioned data visualization tools, or you might want to use an online storage service such as Dropbox. The main point here is people are saying, I can do this at home, why can't I do it at work? So that's the myth done with. So what's the IT department to do, or what's the IT department faced with when it comes to all those trends and pressures? And that's the point that is outlined on the slide that I'm sure is about to appear on your screen, which is all about the balancing. I'm sorry, Harry, did you just want to throw in a point? I'm sorry, I'm on a roll here. I'll let you get in a word edgeways.
No, I think you bring up a great point. But I think it's also, I think the way I look at this is it's even broader perhaps, right? Because I remember a time when I used to go to work to get access to technology. That's where I used to go, and it used to be easy to do email. My internet connection was faster. But now, a lot of the technology that's available to me, it's all available at home or on a device, and we can call it consumerization. But really what I see is that, I now have choice. I can choose to use different services, and I think the bigger question we all have to ask ourselves is, what kind of world do we want to create, and what kind of world do we want to actually live in? Because I think there's often, in the West, and I've seen this both living in Europe and also living in the US, that we're constrained with our own set of, I would say, artificial constraints about what we can and what we can't do. And when I look at emerging markets in Latin America and Asia where people haven't had access to technology before, it's quite fascinating talking to those folks that a lot of the assumptions that we take for granted just don't hold true. So giving them access to technologies in new ways completely starts to reshape the landscape and starts to drive this conversation that you talk about between IT and the user.
And in fact, a good point there is as well, that is probably using the application I want to use, that is probably more of a Gen Y driver than the I want to connect my own device, because they have grown up with being on the internet, with picking and choosing apps for their smartphones and their tablet devices and whatnot. Yeah, very good point. So going back to the IT side, I could have chosen a different analogy there and showing IT in almost an impossible position, because balancing user needs and expectations, which are increasing, is getting quite difficult, because we've got all those trends we've talked about, in particular the multi-location working, end users expecting to have more control, and of course end users getting ever more savvy, not only in being able and wanting to choose apps and whatever, but also in finding ways around restrictions that IT might wish to impose. And those trends, if anything, are accelerating. But when you look at the other side of that balancing act, costs are foremost in probably everybody's mind these days, and cost pressures are not going to get any easier, whereas to security are increasing, as indeed are regulatory compliance demands that are being made upon companies, and all of those, again, of course, involve cost. So the question really comes into it, is there anything that we can do from an IT perspective to rebalance, to make sure that we have that balance, but also to put the personal back into personal computing? And that, I think, is where you have quite a bit to say, Harry.
Yes, well, thank you. I mean, I think that's fascinating data and research. And from my perspective, when I look at sort of the macro trends that are happening, and I look at, first of all, today, what do we have? I mean, today we have a fairly, and again, especially I apply this to the European market and the U.S. market in particular, but we have this concept of a desktop, which is this monolithic thing that we've all grown up with. A lot of us, especially me, it's rather kind of homogeneous, and it's managed as a silo. But when we look at what's happening, kind of in a broader perspective, from an IT perspective, you've got things like Windows 7, VDI, terminal services, and SaaS-based infrastructures, and a whole host of other forces that are entering the workforce. And really, what it is, the way I kind of summarize it, is that your client architecture diversity is increasing. So as enterprises face choice of client architectures, there's a race to figure out how you actually handle, manage, govern, and provide them in a cost-effective manner. And really, we're moving kind of from a world of homogeneous, single device-centric architectures to a world where there's more heterogeneous architectures. And really, the question becomes, at a broader level, well, what does all of that really mean? And when I hear words like cloud and I hear words like virtualization, just given kind of my background, having worked in IT, I've always been faced with buzzwords in my career, and I always kind of take it back to basics and say, well, what does it mean for me if I was still working in IT? And the way I look at it is that most IT organizations are still very much in the, I would say, the predict and accept business. We're predicting what the users need and asking them to accept it. Whereas in this new world where there are lots of services that become available, the question becomes, how do you change your model? How do you change to more of a model where you can deliver as a service? And I think everything is becoming as a service, because fundamentally, irrespective of AppSense, irrespective of any vendor, if you think about what cloud means, it means consuming services. Those services could be internally hosted, they could be externally hosted. But in order to be able to consume those services, you have to almost act like a service provider if you're in IT. But in order to do that, you really have to understand what your infrastructure is, what it needs to do, and what service it actually provides, and to whom. And that requires a fundamental shift in the way that you think. And there are lots of forces that are going to drive that, I think, exponentially. I mean, just look at the number of devices that there are out there in the world, right? The number of devices is going up. And just this weekend, I read a really interesting statistic that for the first time in 2011, the number of smartphones and the shipments was greater than PCs. And that PC number included tablets. So it's fascinating that people are beginning to work on smartphones. The US military, for example, has a secure version of the Google Android operating system, which they're going to offer on the front line. So there's clear and compelling evidence that the number of devices are going to get more and more diverse. So it really, really begs the question, can you really be in the device management business? And as the number of devices begin to, I guess, become more diversified, the types of applications also become diversified. So, will everything be on the web, or will people want to use native applications? I think the reality is you're going to get a mix. You're going to get some applications which are written and designed and optimized for the device and leveraging all of the capabilities, and others which will be hosted and delivered from the cloud. I don't think you can argue that we're going to go from a monolithic running only on a PC world to a monolithic running only in the cloud hosted world. I think you're going to have a whole mix of everything, so it gets more complex. And then when you look at the number of kind of unique configurations that people will want across this diversity. There's a kind of, a force multiplier, and because people are different. And it's very easy when people talk about concepts like a stateless desktop or single image VDI. All of that, in reality, if you've spent any time working in the real world, is a day one scenario. Day two, something changes in the environment. It always does, and sometimes, I'm a little bit of a physics buff here. It's almost like, entropy. It's a natural law. Everything moves from order to disorder. Right? That's just the way the world works, and it's natural. So I think you just have to accept that and understand that in this ever-increasing world of diversity and choice, that change will continually occur, and you have to manage that in a way that's, pragmatic and sensible. And also, I think people's behaviors are changing. I think you had some fantastic data on reasons people want to be more mobile, who the drivers are, the executives or the Gen Y folks. But that really starts to provide kind of this combinatorial explosion and puts a massive burden on IT. And when you think about that burden, sometimes you kind of have to say, well, what does that mean actually to me in terms of use cases? Because I was previous to AppSense, I was CTO at Citrix, and we used to talk to a lot of customers as well about why they're doing a particular desktop or a VDI project. And at AppSense, similarly, we talk to customers about different projects. I think the most important lesson I can, having been a customer and spoken to hundreds of customers, is how do you really, really tie it to something that matters to you? Because the biggest reason that most people fail is they don't really understand why they're doing a particular project. And the key reasons I find that people are doing various projects in the desktop or the user virtualization space, primarily today it's Windows 7. It's very much a tactical response to something. Most people are saying, hey, I've got this Windows 7 migration, I need to do something. So they're either looking at VDI or they're looking at user virtualization. But the bigger reason when I talk to the more strategic customers, when somebody says to me, why did particular customer X go 100% VDI or terminal services? It's really about business agility, about being able to do moving into countries faster, whether they're thinking about data center consolidation, whether they're thinking about restacking their IT organization and looking at it a different way so you can move the help desk to different parts of the country. They may be thinking about M&A or branch office, disaster recovery. Do they rethink about disaster recovery if they're worried about disease and flu, and there's other disruptions that can occur, which could be infrastructure. I mean, Tokyo, I spoke to a lot of customers recently with the nuclear disaster they had. Right? So how do you deal with that as a business and stay in business for your customers? And I think all of that then becomes, well, virtual desktops may be a strategy, it may not be. Physical desktops may be a strategy. And also then when you go back to services in terms of what services are you going to consume internally or externally, I really think fundamentally you have to tie it to what are the real drivers for your particular business. And
I'd add one more example to what you've just listed there, Harry, and that is companies that are expanding internationally and that are having to take, in the current economic environment, increasingly greater risks. They can't just spend a year or so planning which country to go into, then slowly build up a permanent presence in that country. They need to take the risk of going in there, renting some temporary offices, opening it up, seeing how it goes, and if it doesn't go well, shutting down again. They need working office environment very quickly, and all they want is to have to buy a few PCs and put them on the desks.
Right, and I think that's a great point, because I think there are many use cases, and because there are many use cases, what happens is that you can end up with multiple client architectures to solve for these, right? So you may use some physical laptops, you may use physical PCs, you may use VDI or app virtualization. All of these various, I would say, product architectures and silos offer you different benefits. Really, ultimately, you have to say, well, what makes sense for you if you really understand the use case? I think that presents a challenge, because what happens is as this diversity starts to enter and you realize that there's no such thing as a silver bullet that will solve all your use cases, you start to say, well, do I start to deal with all of these silos as separate, disconnected, disparate instances? What's the common view? What if I want to change from one architecture to another? What if I want to migrate in the future, or whatever this may be. And the question becomes is that adds complexity and it adds costs. And the reason for that is our whole model of thinking has been very device-centric. We either manage the device, we manage the session, we manage the application. It's very object kind of management based. And really, when you look across all of these architectures, what AppSense, we think about it, well, the most common element is the user. And the user is the one thing that holds true across these environments. So our view is that if you can start to manage and describe as a service multiple instances, all the granularity and the richness of what represents that user experience, for the lack of a better word, right, you're my experience everywhere. So how do I provide my experience across these different client architectures based on the use case, based on the need, based on the respective drivers? And we think about that as user virtualization, which we think is often misunderstood as just a profile problem. We think profiles represent part of that, but it's far, far richer. And the slide I have up here, we call it internally, fondly, the donut. And the donut, the AppSense donut, is often really trying to say, look, it's like DNA, right? They're comprised of DNA. They have differences and they have different needs. So you may have personalization needs. So you may want to personalize a VDI instance, but you may also want to personalize a physical desktop instance. But you may also want to allow self-service where users can roll back individual settings for themselves. You may want to say, well, what should users be allowed to do? What's secure? What's manageable? What's licensed and permissioned, right? So that kind of gets into the whole permissions and rights aspects of it, and how do you describe all of that policy? And then you start to say, well, what about their particular desktop application instance? How do you configure all of that individuality there? How do you deal with all of the runtime environment things that you need to do, which is like login scripts, group policy, all these settings that you do manually? How do you deal with them? Right? Do you deal with them as individual silos? Or do you start to say, well, let's make the user the new primary key and start to key off that user and understand all of these attributes? And then we can start to put some conditional logic around this, because if you've begun to abstract that, you can then start to say, well, let's put some conditions around it. So you could say, well, if the user is inside or outside of the network, you can take a different set of actions and conditions. Well, if they're inside the network. And that really begins to, it lets you start to describe the rules and use cases that you want, and it starts to give you a lot of control and governance around the user's experience, giving them the flexibility and freedom they need, but also enabling IT to provide the freedom that they want. And then I think it becomes even richer. Right? We don't just stop there, which is what I've given you is, I would argue, is very much a traditional Windows view of the world. But as the world becomes more diverse in terms of apps and devices, then what happens to your personal applications? What kind of choices of apps do you want? How do you deal with use cases or problems like user-installed apps? Right. So we have technologies like Strata apps, which is designed to start to address some of those. That goes even further, right? So how do you think about the user's data? What becomes possible there? Should users have choice of where they put their data? Should they be allowed to put it in Dropbox or somewhere else, or put it in the enterprise? Why should it matter from a user's perspective if IT can govern it? And then it starts to kind of get into more of the realm of the possible, because ultimately, we talk about user virtualization as a platform, but when you start to understand all this richness, can you start to connect people in new ways that haven't been possible? So can you start to democratize a lot of the technology that's available and make it available in a simplistic, consumable way as a service? So all of that becomes, all feasible. And once you understand, how to, relate all of this sophisticated technology, I would say, to deal with all of this complexity, because you need sophisticated sets of solutions, right? You need a sophisticated suite, is our belief, in order to deal with this diversity, because otherwise what you will end up with is you'll end up with lots of point solutions, and those point solutions typically end up taking you in 20 different directions, solves a very tactical problem, but there's no ability to grow. Right? But on the flip side, that also presents sometimes a conundrum for some customers, because when they look at this level of capability, they think, well, where do I get started? And I think that's it's a very, very reasonable and practical question to ask. And what we like to think about it is the UV journey. And I think you can start at different points, right? This is not meant to be a sequential journey. It depends on your needs and where you are. Now, some people, it's absolutely fine to start with a specific issue that they're faced with, and that issue could be something like profile. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Your issue could also be, I've got a Windows 7 migration to, and I need to migrate some settings. That's fine, right? So you can start there if that's what you need to do. Then there's also about cost reduction, because ultimately, if you believe that this is about service management and managing as a service across multiple client architectures, you can start to bring your environment all into the kind of this realm of managing as a service, right? Transforming your organization. So I think that's all about kind of the cost reduction aspects on a particular migration, then become transformational. And ultimately, I think, what I said earlier, I think it is all about the primary key. The primary key tomorrow is all about the person, the user, and really keying off that user and understanding the contextuality of that user, what they need, where they need it, how you provide that experience. And the way I sometimes describe it to folks is, it's almost like, how do you create this human-computer bridge? Because you've got people who've got work spheres and they've got personal spheres, but you've got all of this compute power that's being made available in places that we never thought they would be made available before. So how do you begin to bridge and connect people to all of this technology and allow them to work in new ways and to also play in new ways? And I think that becomes very, it becomes possible only if you can key off the user. So that's kind of my view on it. So Martha, I just want to hand back to you to perhaps help us wrap.
No, you've certainly put it very well there about putting the personal back in PC, putting people-centric computing really is what you're saying. But looking at it in the current environment, obviously the existing pressures remain that I've listed here. What we haven't talked about really, that I'd just like to mention as well, is all of the hidden costs that are in all of that, whether it's day-to-day support or something new being rolled out. There is a hidden cost in, for example, having to support the user, getting them out of a fix that they've got into, having different point solutions to deal with, as you've just alluded to, Harry. And then, of course, you've got the whole lost productivity element that for most companies is completely invisible, because if somebody spends an hour trying to sort out their computer or waiting for it to boot up or redoing some settings or hot desking where the computer isn't set up right and trying to figure out how to do what you actually know to do but not on this very computer, all of that is a hidden cost, because that person will not leave at 6 o'clock or whatever and leave their one done. They will probably stay late, and it eats into their private time. It may affect their health. I don't want to sound overly dramatic here, but it does all add up, and it's not just the users themselves that are losing time. The productivity of their colleagues is also affected. We've all been to offices where the cry for help goes up and somebody says, "Can somebody help me?" This or that has happened. Nothing new there, but this is where the additional pressures, and they are really additional, are coming on top of it, with changing work patterns, end user expectations, end users who are expecting more than before, who are expecting things of a similar level of sophistication and choice that they have in their personal lives, in particular when they're of the more tech-savvy kind of, I don't want to say younger generations, because it's not really a generational issue. You can have young people who are not so tech savvy, and you can have older workers who very much are, but overall generations are getting more tech savvy, and that's where the whole consumerization element comes into it, with people potentially wanting to connect their own computers from home to something in the company, or they want to use applications of their choice. And this is where we have that whole new way of delivering applications, where companies are really beginning to think about different ways of delivering corporate computing, whereby it doesn't have to be the traditional way of having this is the corporate back-end application and this is the front end that is delivered to the desktop. Why not separate the two? You can have possibly a different tool on the desktop accessing that back end, depending on the task that a particular end user is actually carrying out. It doesn't have to be the same front end for everybody. That's what I mean by new ways of delivering applications, and that's quite aside from web access and any of that sort of thing. It really is a completely different way of delivering corporate computing, and that's, I think, where I'll hand back to you, Harry, for the last point on transformation.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head, right? It's about creating an ability to deliver these different kinds of services. And my firm belief is that most IT organizations are not set up to do that. So really the big question, I would ask any person in IT who's thinking about their career in 5 to 10 years is, what is your job? Is your job status quo? Can it exist? Perhaps it can, right? But my view is that for a lot of people, that's just not going to be the case. And I think the role of IT has to transform. There's an organizational transformation that has to take place. So IT, my advice to anybody in IT would be start to think like a service provider and behave like a service provider, because if you don't, you probably won't be relevant. And I'm sorry if that's bad news, but I also like to be honest with people. And I think there's tremendous opportunity for those people who understand that perspective of technology for vendor, but I think there is a larger macro shift that is happening in our industry, and it's too big to ignore.
Thank you, Harry and Martha. Our presenters will now address any questions you may have. If you please enter your questions in the question box, and we'll have them address them. The first question we have is this user virtualization technology just for VDI, Harry?
Well, if you choose to do it that way, sure. But I think the bigger picture here is that I think that's a myth that's portrayed through misunderstanding, because people think it's just a profile solution. I think ultimately, look, what this is about is choice. There is going to be choice that's forced upon the enterprise just through the innovation that's happening out there in the world. And I think the bigger question is, how do you deal with that choice entering the enterprise? And really, I think your current way of operating, or your method, your process, people, your skills, I think that's going to be completely turned on its head. And my belief is that you cannot be in a device-centric world anymore. You have to move to a user-centric world, because that's the only thing that's common. Martha, I don't know if you have any further thing to add to that question.
The main point that I would make, aside from agreeing with everything that you've said, is around that it'll be a blended environment. Yes, there will no doubt remain pure environments, and where you've only got virtualization and only fully capable everything running on the desktop. But you will have to take care of a blended environment where you've got both, and where you may also need to deliver different kinds of services depending on the situation of the user. Like I mentioned at the beginning, somebody may be in the office, or they may even be accessing something from an internet cafe, or they may be in a location where you don't even trust the hotel.
Harry, we have sort of an added question from Ciara. She would like you to expand on your last statement. The future of IT workers need to think like a service provider?
Yes. So, so thank you for that question. Something I've written about in the past as well. I think ultimately, what you have to really think about is, what is your job as a IT person? And really your job, I think for a lot of people, and I apologize if I'm generalizing overly, but I think is often to administer a particular service, give access to an application. It's highly commoditized. It's becoming highly commoditized. And if you look at what's happened in the past in terms of spend, so when I worked at Goldman Sachs previous to Citrix, a lot of the challenges I would face with defending budgets every year was, well, how much money, Harry, are you spending on operational expense versus innovation expense? And really the reaction to that was initially was, well, outsource jobs to India or Eastern Europe or Latin America. Even the kind of the labor arbitrage strategy only goes so far, because quality goes down and there's only a finite number of smart people. And then the next piece of the bandwagon has been, well, let's automate everything and let's kind of make everything autonomous, workflow, runbook automation. All of those things have started to happen as well. And they only go so far, frankly, because they're also a point-in-time capture of state. And really, I think the future role of IT is to say, look, at the end of the day, IT is not going to own all assets. They don't need to, because let's face it, if somebody builds a service in the cloud, right, and everybody likes to use a Salesforce example, but there'll be many more, I expect, over the next several years. But why not use them? Why not be able to put data in the cloud and only host the things that you absolutely need to do? I mean, so many organizations, still host email. I mean, why? Is it regulatory? I mean, what is the real reason? I think for a lot of people, it's just because it's always been done that way. And I think what happens is, as you kind of, all of this stuff that becomes available to you, as an IT person, you can say, well, I can be a consumer of these services. They could be created, owned, hosted, and managed by yourself, for reasons X, Y, and Z. Or you could go to an outside provider and say, hey, this makes sense. And really, how do you join that up and aggregate those services and provide that in a way that's meaningful to your business? So as an IT person, if you understand what your business needs and you know how to stitch together the right kind of services to provide the most optimal experience for the users that's cost effective, et cetera, I think you're starting to act like a service provider, right? So you're a masher-upper is a term I've used in the past, right? You mash up these services and you bring them together. And I think that role and mindset of IT shifts from managing a particular silo or programming for a system to really becoming a solution provider. Otherwise, frankly, I think, if I was a CEO of an organization, I'd be looking to outsource more IT because it's commoditized and perhaps cheaper to get from the outside. And I think that's the only way you're going to grow and learn as somebody in IT in the future. So,
Martha, you have something to add?
Yeah, indeed, because there is another aspect to it. I think it's very important to bear in mind in this service provider thinking, and that's if we think back to what happened during the dot-com bubble, which of course was around about the time as well when IT people were very, very busy remediating Y2K problems. And a lot of businesses, they went to IT saying, we want this, we want to do that, why can't we do this? And a lot of the time they got the answer from IT, we need to solve Y2K first. And of course, there was a very good reason for that. But what happened is that increasingly businesses just went out and procured whatever they wanted or needed, and then later on IT was asked to stitch it all together, to use Harry's terms, with a result that you end up with a complete mishmash in infrastructure, you end up potentially with security issues, you end up with increased costs because it has to be done all over again, because sooner or later IT has to be involved, because of course the business needs to have connectivity with all of the in-house data, etc., etc. I don't need to go into more details in that. And I'm seeing some of those same pressures happening again, where businesses are saying, why should this take so long? I'm going to go outside if you can't give it to me. So that is another, I think, quite pressing reason why the thinking and attitude needs to move into the direction of that service provider, one that Harry's outlined.
So we have another question coming in from Peter. He wants to know, how do we deliver IT as a service with AppSense products?
Yeah, so first thing is, I don't think AppSense would ever make the claim that we solve IT as a service in its entirety. We absolutely don't, and I think any vendor who claims to do that is, probably stretching the truth. My view is what we do is we do our piece of it, right? What we do is that we are intensely focused on the user aspects to it. So we want to make kind of, user management or, describing the user DNA so that it can be used and centrally managed and applied across these different diverse client architectures. That is our business. So we do the user piece of the stack of IT as a service. But ultimately, look, your whole data center is going to become as a service, right? You're going to do server virtualization, storage virtualization, probably network virtualization, app virtualization, desktop virtualization, and I think we are the user stack. So that's the bit that we do.
So are you suggesting that user virtualization become a strategic part of the IT stack? I mean, what's in it for IT?
I think you have to, right? Because if you don't key off the user, what else is common across all of those architectures that makes sense? And I don't think it's just AppSense saying that, right? I think, even if you look at some of the, messaging from Microsoft, for example, that talks about user state virtualization, even you listen to the messaging from VMware and Citrix, I think as an industry, I think we all understand that it's shifting towards the user. The question is, how much depth, breadth, and more importantly, focus do you have? I mean, this is all we do, right? We only focus on the the kind of the vision that I have from a product perspective is all about my experience everywhere. And if you don't have sophisticated capability, it's really impossible to do it well.
And to pick up on that point, what's in it for IT? I think with the kinds of technologies that you're offering, what's in it for IT is, to put it slightly flippantly, an easier life. Because a lot of the things that are being done manually at the moment and take up a lot of time, they can be automated, and it allows you to sleep more easily at night, I would have thought.
Okay, and also we have another question from Syrian. So do you also think that the future may be using products in the enterprise like Citrix, NetScaler, CloudBridge?
Yeah, I think they form part of it. Also, products like VMware Horizon, because I think what they are is about, they're trying to become aggregators. Also, companies like Centrix, who we're partners with as well. And really that's about, providing you access to services and giving you single identity. And I think, we partner with all of those folks. And again, to do that successfully, you still need lots of user information and contextuality. So we don't want to be a cloud bridge provider. Right? So again, I don't think AppSense pretends to do the whole stack. We do the rich user aspects, which then plugs into that kind of an architecture.
Great. We have another question. This transformation you mentioned seems very complex. Where would you start, or how would you start?
Again, I think the number one piece of advice, if there's anything you're going to take away from this webinar, is understand why you're doing your particular project, right? So whether if it's a VDI project, or if it's a M&A project, or if it's a disaster recovery project, understand what you're actually trying to do, right? Versus from a business driver perspective, or ask yourself the question, are you just doing a tactical point solution, kind of scenario? And I think really you have to understand where you're starting in this UV journey. Understand your belief, first of all, right? If you believe the world is going to become user-centric, and that's where we need to go, then you need to start to figure out where it makes the most sense for you. That could be a completely strategic project, etc., or it could be start with a very simple use case, right? A very simple rollout. It could be your Windows 7 rollout, right? It could be for your disaster recovery. It could be for a particular building project, which is fine. So understand where you're going to start and how it applies. And I think the key point is it's journey, right? It doesn't happen overnight. There is no magic bullet. So, ask yourself, who do you want to make a bet with? Somebody who's investing in this space, or do you want to just have a point solution type of approach?
Okay. We have a more basic question here. Doesn't everything get fixed in a browser?
So, Martha, I'm sure you have lots of research on that opinion.
But my short answer would be, if only. And that's for two reasons. Number one, no matter how we look at it, there is just not the same richness in the browser. And also, and that's one thing that we do also know from research and experience, no matter how much we would like it, but it's just not possible to rely on always-on connectivity. So, and of course, there are security issues in the browser as well. So there is a whole host of reasons why you wouldn't want to rely on just delivering everything through the browser.
Yeah, and I'd echo that and say kind of, my view of this is, look, we're not going to move from one type of homogeneous architecture, which was just a PC, to another homogeneous architecture, because what people want is choice. And if devices have capabilities and processing power, use them. Why not? People will write apps for that and take advantage. If you can then scale and give things better access in the cloud, that makes sense. So I think we're going to live in this hybrid world, and it's going to get more complicated. And I go back to, that's why I think the user is so important.
So we only have a few minutes left, so we'll take one last question. And we have a question here. Will AppSense continue to build multiple platform capabilities? What are the future plans?
So short answer is yes, sure, of course, because we are a user virtualization platform. Right? We believe that we want to empower users to work in new ways. I have that aspiration of, let's rethink about, how the world is going to work. And all I'll say is watch this space, and we've got some, interesting things coming up, which we'll talk about, mobile, and we will start to reveal some of our data strategy as well. Right? You'll begin to see that. But yeah, fundamentally, look, users want choice of device, apps, and client architectures, and we are in the business of solving those problems. And we do that in, we're not going to solve everything overnight. We're going to take pragmatic steps that move forward and working with our customers and finding use cases that make sense.
So we'll squeeze in one last question from Peter. How about mobile devices like iPhone? What value would you add there?
So again, right, so, who's our customer, right? So our primary customer is the enterprise customer. That's who we primarily serve. Every day I get an iPhone or an iPad something question, right, or a Mac question. So I know, without revealing particular pre-announcements, right, I think absolutely we're focused on the mobile space, and yeah, it's an important area for us to really kind of start to enable for the right use cases. So watch this space is all I can say.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Harry and Martha. A recording of this webinar will be available within 24 hours. And those of you who have joined us will also receive the Freeform Dynamics Smart Guide. And that will be it. Thank you for joining us.